Gear 2 is a multiplier of Luffy's base physical abilities, but how big is that multiplier? While the story doesn't actually give us an answer to this question, I thought it would be fun to try and find one, and thus this video. Now, how fast Luffy moves in this form compared to normal is unknown. We know that base Luffy has speed relative to base Lucci, but it is still noticeably slower. However, in Gear 2, Luffy is not only faster than base Lucci, but he's faster than Lucci in his hybrid form as well, although they are still relative. Rereading the fight, I noticed that it is made rather apparent that Gear 2 Luffy actually has the upper hand against Lucci, until the negatives of Gear 2 really start to take effect. However, trying to figure out a multiplier for the form is still rather difficult. Thankfully, this is the only arc with power levels, so even if we won't ever know for sure, we can get an estimate. Doiki is a measurement of physical power output. This means that it's going to be a multiplication of speed and strength. If person A has a score of 200 and person B has a score of 100, this doesn't mean that person A is twice the speed and twice the strength of person B. If person A was actually double the speed and double the strength, then their Doiki score would be 4 times larger than person B's score. This means that person A having a higher score than person B doesn't allow us to determine anything about their speed or strength. Person A could be the same speed but double the strength of person B, or they could be 1/2 the strength and quadruple the speed. However, for the sake of simplification, we're going to assume that a significantly higher Doiki score means a faster speed and more strength. So if two people are relative in score, they will be relative in speed and strength, and vice versa, unless we're given a reason to believe differently. We know that base Luffy and Zoro should be pretty close in speed and strength, as we have no reason to believe that either of them has significantly outpaced the other since Whiskey Peak. We can infer from a future SBS that Oda views Sanji as faster than base Luffy, but it's probably safe to say that the three of them are still relative to each other. We also know that for zone users, their hybrid form amplifies their power, but we don't know how big this multiplier is. Base Luffy is below base Lucci, meaning that his score would be below 4,000. Zoro is relative to Luffy, but probably slightly under him, meaning that he is also below 4,000, and the same can be said for Sanji. In his fight with Kaku, Zoro is shown to be relative to hybrid Kaku, but Kaku seems to have had a slight speed advantage. The speed advantage shown here is pretty similar to that of Luffy and base Lucci, but a little less drastic. Regardless, this means that hybrid Kaku should be relative to base Lucci, so I think it would be fair to place hybrid Kaku around 4,000 and probably a bit above considering that he had a solid edge against Zoro before Ashura. I think a good multiplier for this would be 2, and thus hybrid Kaku would have a score of 4,400. Sanji is shown to have a clear speed advantage in his fight against hybrid Jabra, who we know is slightly weaker but extremely close to Kaku in power level. Despite this, he was still able to react and attack Sanji, so they are still somewhat relative. This completely tracks with Kaku and Jabra being close in score, and Sanji being the fastest out of base Luffy, Zoro, and himself, so I think it's okay to assume the same multiplier for his hybrid form, which would make his score 4,360. Looking at these two, I think we can assume a 2x multiplier for Lucci as well. With this multiplier, hybrid Lucci would score 8,000. This means that Gear 2 Luffy is somewhere above that. Since base Luffy is below base Lucci, and Gear 2 Luffy is above his hybrid form, I think a multiplier of 3 would work best. With this, we could say that base Luffy has a score of 3,500, and thus in Gear 2 he would have a score of 10,500. Under this framework, hybrid Lucci is more than double the power of base Luffy, but we saw that Luffy was still able to react to, dodge, and even attack hybrid Lucci even if the attacks did no damage. Similarly, base Luffy is more than 4 times as powerful as Blueno, but Blueno was able to attack, dodge, counter, and tank attacks from Luffy. So if Zoro is 1.5 times more powerful than base Kaku, then it stands to reason that their fight would be more relative than the aforementioned two. The reason for that 1.5 multiplier comes from a clash during their fight in which their attacks completely cancel out. For this, Zoro used his 72-pound Phoenix, which is obviously only 66% of the strength of his 108-pound Phoenix attack. We know that the 108-pound Phoenix isn't Zoro's strongest attack, although it is his strongest long-distance attack at this point. If we assume that Kaku's Tempest Kick White Thunder is to base Kaku, what 108-pound Phoenix is to Zoro, then this clash would indicate that base Kaku is roughly 66% the strength of Zoro, which would make Zoro's score before his power-up 3,300. Another clash to support this takes place right after, in which Kaku uses both his swords to attack Zoro while incorporating his Soru. Despite this, Zoro calmly blocks it by sticking one sword into the ground. This shows that he is more than capable of keeping up with Kaku's speed and strength. Going back to Gear 2 Luffy vs hybrid Lucci, by my estimate, Luffy is 1.3 times more powerful than Lucci during the beginning of this fight. This is of course smaller than the difference between Zoro and base Kaku, so then why is the fight so one-sided for the most part? Well, it goes back to Gear 2's speed. If you watch my Gear 2 Explained video, you will know that the travel speed Luffy has in Gear 2 is due to the Soru technique. It's not actually inherent to the form. This means that we don't actually have a multiplier for his travel speed, but if we assume that Soru is a technique that multiplies the user's speed, then that means if you take away Soru from both Luffy and Lucci, Gear 2 Luffy will still be faster than Hybrid Lucci. However, considering how fast his attacks are and the fact that they seem to be at least slightly more powerful than Lucci's as seen here, I think it's quite possible that even without Soru, Gear 2 Luffy is as fast or faster than a Hybrid Lucci with Soru. Meaning that with Soru, Gear 2 Luffy should completely dominate, which is exactly what happens. Another thing you might consider is that Gear 2 Luffy doesn't really incorporate his travel speed into his attacks, unlike Lucci, who we see do this a number of times by speeding up in the direction of his attack. Luffy, on the other hand, travels to his desired position and then attacks from said position for the most part. This is important because Luffy's Gear 2 attacks aren't living up to their full potential, unlike Lucci's. With all this in mind, I think the difference in the Doriki scores is both accurate and coherent with what we see in the actual fight. Now, to cover my bases, you might notice that the difference between base Luffy and Lucci is much smaller, Lucci being only 14% more powerful than Luffy. This might feel a bit off depending on how you interpret the base form fight, but when I reread it, I noticed that there were many scenes indicating that they are pretty equal, and only a few indicating that Lucci had superior speed and the upper hand. So at least in my opinion, I think that they are extremely relative, and thus the smaller difference makes sense. There's not much in substance to look at with the Sanji vs Jabra fight in regards to this because Doriki doesn't actually measure durability, and that seems to be what Sanji struggles with the most with Jabra. But since there is a 20-point difference between Jabra and Kaku, we'll give Sanji a score of 3280 before his power-up. Now there are problems with my estimations. Doriki is obviously not as straightforward as we want it to be. Sanji and Zoro should be relatively close in power output, but Sanji has better speed feats, while Zoro has better strength feats. Doriki is a measurement of physical power output, aka a multiplication of speed and strength, but we don't know how that is divided up for each CP9 agent, and so assuming that it is as straightforward as possible leaves room for quite a bit of error. Plus, when it comes to analyzing attacks, yes, a zone multiplies your physical abilities, but depending on your fighting style, and what zone you have, it can specifically strengthen some attacks even more, like in the case of Kaku and his Sky Slicer. However, I'm pretty satisfied with these results. This would mean that in One Piece, you could still fight someone who is more than 4 times more powerful than you, and I feel like that fits in with what we often see in One Piece, in which much weaker characters are capable of fighting and doing damage to much stronger opponents. Anyways, tell me your thoughts down below, like the video, and subscribe for more. See ya!